In the temple where incense curled toward stone gods, where bronze lamps flickered against walls carved with forgotten prayers, a child stood before an altar older than memory. The year was 237 BCE. The place was Carthage, the great Phoenician city that commanded the western Mediterranean through commerce and naval power. The boy was 9 years old. His name was Hannibal Barca, and what happened in that temple would determine not just his life but the fate of empires. His father's hand rested heavy on his shoulder, not comfort but consecration. Hamilcar Barca, general of Carthage's armies, survivor of the First Punic War, stood as witness and architect of what would unfold. The war with Rome had ended 5 years earlier, had ended in Carthage's defeat and humiliation, had cost Carthage Sicily and a massive indemnity that would burden the city for generations. Hamilcar had not accepted the defeat, had not made peace with the loss. Had instead nurtured hatred like a gardener tending a rare and poisonous plant. The altar before them was dedicated to Baal Hamon, chief among Carthage's gods, the deity who demanded sacrifice and promised victory to those willing to pay the price. The priests had withdrawn, leaving father and son alone in the temple's sacred heart. The moment was private, was intimate, was transfer of inheritance more binding than land or wealth. Hamilcar was about to depart for Iberia to rebuild Carthaginian power there, to create new empire from the ashes of the old, to prepare for the revenge he would not live to see but that he was shaping through this boy standing before the altar. "Place your hand on the sacrifice," Hamilcar said. His voice was steady, was certain, was the voice of a man who had calculated this moment's significance and found it worthy of everything it would cost. Hannibal placed his small hand on the altar, on the offering that smoked and crackled in the temple's heat. "Swear," his father commanded, "swear that you will never be a friend to Rome, swear eternal enmity, swear that you will dedicate your life to Rome's destruction." The boy spoke the oath. The words were simple, a promise of hatred, a vow of vengeance, a commitment to spend his life pursuing Rome's downfall. But the simplicity carried weight beyond the child's comprehension. He was swearing to inherit his father's war, to carry grudges that predated his birth, to make his life's purpose the settling of scores he had not accumulated. The oath demanded everything, demanded that he subordinate personal desire to collective vengeance, demanded that he become weapon rather than person, demanded that he sacrifice normal life, marriage and children and peace and the simple pleasures of existence for the singular purpose of destroying Rome. Did he understand what he was promising? Did a 9-year-old child comprehend the weight of eternal enmity? Did he grasp that this moment would define every choice he made for the next 50 years? Perhaps not. Perhaps the understanding came later, came gradually as the oath's implications revealed themselves through campaigns and exile and the long arc toward tragic end. But in the moment, in the temple with incense smoke and his father's hand on his shoulder and the gods watching or not watching, Hannibal spoke the words, made the promise. Bound himself, the Barca family, their name meant lightning in Punic, were not merely generals but keepers of Carthage's wounded pride, were bearers of grudges that nations carry like heirlooms. Were the military dynasty that emerged when Carthage, a commercial empire that preferred trade to conquest, found itself forced to become warrior state to survive. Hamilcar embodied this transformation, had fought Rome brilliantly in Sicily during the First Punic War, had never been defeated in the field, but had watched Carthage's government sue for peace despite his victories, had endured the humiliation of peace treaty that stripped Carthage of Sicily, had witnessed Rome seize Sardinia and Corsica afterward, a violation of the treaty that Carthage was too weak to resist. The bitterness had poisoned him, had transformed him from soldier into avenger, and now he was transferring that poison to his son, was making Hannibal the vessel for hatreds that should have died with the previous generation, was ensuring that the war would continue even after Hamilcar himself was dead. The transfer was deliberate, was calculated, was Hamilcar's final strategy to create in his son a weapon that would outlast him. But there was more than hatred in that temple moment. There was also love, twisted love perhaps, love that expressed itself through burden rather than gift, but love nonetheless. Hamilcar was giving Hannibal purpose, was offering meaning, was promising that his son's life would matter, would achieve significance, would be remembered. The alternative, growing up as son of defeated general in a diminished Carthage, offered nothing comparable. The oath gave Hannibal destiny, gave him reason to endure hardship, gave him the certainty that his suffering would serve something larger than himself. Years later, when Roman historians asked Hannibal about the origin of his hatred for Rome, he would point to this moment, would describe the temple and the oath and his father's hand on his shoulder, would explain that he had been raised to hate Rome the way other children were raised to honor their gods. The hatred was not chosen, was inherited, was implanted before choice was possible, was the foundational reality of his existence. The priests returned, the ceremony concluded, father and son left the temple and walked into Carthage's bright sunlight, but the shadow they had sworn in remained. He followed Hannibal across decades and continents, defined every decision from that day forward. The oath could not be unsworn, could not be revised or reconsidered, was absolute in the way only childhood promises can be, innocent in origin but terrible in consequence. We close with the temple's silence after they departed, the incense smoke slowly dissipating, the lamps flickering lower. The gods, if they existed, if they cared, witnessing what had been promised and knowing what it would cost. The shadow cast by that childhood vow, the weight of promises made before we understand what we promise. The destiny chosen for us that becomes the destiny we choose because we know no other. The oath was sworn, the child became weapon, the hatred was transferred, and in that temple moment Hannibal Barca began the journey that would make him one of history's greatest generals and one of its most tragic figures, forever bound, forever driven, forever carrying the oath sworn in shadow. The promise that could not be broken, the hatred that could not be quenched, the destiny that could not be escaped. The temple stands empty now, has stood empty for 2,000 years, but the echo of that oath remains in every history written about Hannibal, remains in the understanding that sometimes the most important moments in a life are the moments when we are too young to refuse what is being imposed upon us. The oath, the shadow, the beginning of everything that followed. A Carthage rose from the North African shore like a dream made stone, like ambition given physical form, like commerce transformed into architecture that reached toward heaven. The city crowned a peninsula that jutted into the Mediterranean, surrounded by water on 3 sides, protected by walls 40 feet high and triply layered for depth that could not be breached. From the sea, approaching merchants saw first the harbors, the circular military harbor that could house 200 warships, the rectangular merchant harbor where vessels from Spain and Sicily, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules unloaded cargoes that made Carthage wealthy beyond Roman comprehension. The terraced gardens ascended from the harbors toward the Baissa, the citadel that overlooked everything. And trees that should not have grown in this climate flourished through irrigation systems that brought water from distant mountains. Flowers bloomed in colors that seemed stolen from sunset. The gardens were not merely beautiful, were statement of power, demonstration that Carthage could make the earth yield whatever Carthage desired, were proof that wealth could purchase paradise. But the true wealth, the foundation of everything, came not from earth but from sea. From the purple dye harvested from murex snails, the precious substance that gave Carthage its Greek name, Phoenicia, land of purple. The dye works lined the coast outside the city walls, places where thousands of snails were crushed to produce mere ounces of dye, where the smell was overpowering but the profit was immense. The purple cloth that Carthage produced clothed emperors and kings. Only the wealthiest could afford it, only the most powerful dared wear it. And Carthage controlled the secret of its production, controlled the trade networks that distributed it, controlled the wealth that flowed from it. The markets were sensory overwhelm. Languages mingled like spices: Punic, Greek, Berber, Iberian, Celtic tongues from distant Gaul. Merchants from every corner of the known world gathered here because Carthage was where trade routes converged, where goods from Africa met goods from Europe, where the exotic and the essential were exchanged for silver and gold. The air tasted of salt and cinnamon and possibility, tasted of profits being made and fortunes being built, tasted of a civilization that had chosen commerce over conquest and had prospered beyond any military empire's achievements. The temples rose throughout the city, temples to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, to the Phoenician gods that Carthage's founders had brought from Tyre centuries earlier. The worship included practices that shocked Greek and Roman observers. A child sacrifice, according to hostile sources. Offerings of infants burned in the Tophet, the sacred precinct where bronze statues held the tiny victims. Modern archaeology debates whether this actually happened or was propaganda invented by enemies, but real or exaggerated, the reputation added to Carthage's mystique, made it seem foreign, made it seem dangerous, made it seem other in ways that Rome could never fully understand or accept. The government was oligarchic republic power shared among wealthy families who controlled trade and commanded armies. The Suffites, annually elected magistrates, held executive authority. The Senate of several hundred members deliberated policy. The Assembly of Citizens ratified major decisions. The system was sophisticated, was designed to prevent tyranny while maintaining efficiency, was proof that Carthage understood governance as well as it understood commerce. But the system also created weakness, created divisions among the elite, created situations where generals like Hamilcar Barca could operate with dangerous independence because the government was too fractured to control them. Beneath the prosperity lived ancient fear. The memory of the First Punic War, the brutal 23-year conflict that had bled both Rome and Carthage white, haunted every council meeting. The war had begun over Sicily, had been fought primarily at sea, had cost both sides hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. Carthage had lost, had been forced to surrender Sicily, to pay massive indemnity, to accept treaty that acknowledged Roman dominance. The humiliation burned in the hearts of generals who had not been defeated in battle but whose government had surrendered nonetheless. Burned in the pride of a city that had considered itself Rome's equal and had been proven wrong. Then came the second humiliation. In the years after the First Punic War, while Carthage was distracted by the mercenary revolt, a brutal uprising of unpaid soldiers who nearly destroyed Carthage from within, Rome had seized Sardinia and Corsica, had simply taken them, had violated the peace treaty, had dared Carthage to respond, and Carthage, weakened and exhausted, had done nothing, had accepted the theft, had swallowed another humiliation. The seizure was act of naked aggression, was proof that Rome respected no treaties when weakness invited exploitation, was demonstration that peace with Rome was merely intermission between wars. The Barcids Hamilcar and his sons Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago represented Carthage's response to these humiliations, represented the faction that refused to accept permanent inferiority to Rome, represented the military party that believed Carthage must rebuild its power, must prepare for the next war, must never again be in position where it had to accept Roman aggression without response. Hamilcar had taken his family to Iberia after the First Punic War, had conquered tribes there, had established what was essentially Barcid Empire in Spain, silver mines that enriched Carthage, armies loyal to Hamilcar personally, bases for future campaigns against Rome. Young Hannibal grew up in this Iberian empire, learned war by watching his father campaign, learned strategy by observing how Hamilcar conquered tribes through combination of military force and diplomatic alliance, learned that loyalty of soldiers mattered more than orders from distant Carthage, learned that general with army and resources could operate independently of government's wishes. The lessons would serve him well, would make him effective commander, would also make him dangerous to Carthage's oligarchy, who feared generals with too much power, but always there was the contradiction. Carthage wanted to be left alone to trade and prosper, wanted peace that would allow commerce to flourish, did not want wars that disrupted trade routes and consumed resources. Yet Carthage existed in a world where Rome was expanding, where military power determined survival, where peaceful trading empire was vulnerable to aggressive military empire. The Barcids understood this, understood that Carthage could not remain peaceful trading nation if that meant becoming Roman subordinate. The transformation from commercial empire to military power was necessary, was survival, but was also betrayal of everything Carthage had been. We sit with this tension. Sit with the question of whether Carthage could have avoided the Second Punic War. Whether different choices, accommodation with Rome, permanent acceptance of inferior status, focusing purely on commerce in territories Rome did not want might have preserved Carthage. The Barcids would have said no, would have argued that Rome's appetite was infinite, that accommodation invited further aggression, that only strength deterred Roman expansion. But others in Carthage disagreed, believed the war was Barcid vendetta that destroyed city for sake of family pride. The city at dusk, purply sailed ships returning to harbor, the merchant quarter alive with final transactions of the day, the Biasa catching last light like crown of gold. The sacred beauty of a city that would be destroyed, that would be erased so completely that archaeologists would spend centuries trying to recover what had been lost. That would become byword for utter destruction. Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, the phrase that Cato the Elder would repeat endlessly until Rome finally accomplished the task. But in Hannibal's youth Carthage still stood proud, still commanded wealth, still held position as one of Mediterranean's great powers. The future was uncertain but not yet tragic. The city built on purple and gold, forever beautiful, forever vulnerable. Forever standing at the edge of transformation that would lead either to glory or to annihilation. The harbors reflecting starlight, the gardens breathing perfume into the night, the city that chose between peace and survival and discovered that the choice was illusion. Forever Carthage, forever the dream that became stone. Forever the civilization that tried to buy safety with wealth and learned too late that only power preserves peace. The Pyrenees rose before the army like the spine of a sleeping god, like the edge of the known world made vertical, like a barrier placed by nature to separate the possible from the forbidden. The mountains stretched from Mediterranean to Atlantic, peaks sharp as broken promises, valleys lost in mist, passes that seemed to lead not to Gaul but to the underworld itself. It was spring of 218 BCE. Hannibal stood at the mountain's base, 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry and 37 elephants behind him, the impossible before him. The question was simple and absolute: how do you cross what cannot be crossed? The Romans believed the Pyrenees protected them, believed that mountains this vast were barriers no army could overcome with force and supplies intact. Believed that Hannibal would do what every general before him had done: turn back, find another route, accept the mountains' refusal. They believed this because it was reasonable, because the Pyrenees were not merely high but hostile, because the tribes that inhabited the mountains were fierce and knew every ambush point, because moving an army with baggage train and elephants through terrain that challenged even shepherds was madness that no rational commander would attempt. But Hannibal understood something the Romans did not, understood that impossible is simply a map not yet drawn, that what has never been done is not the same as what cannot be done, that the enemy's certainty about what you will not attempt is opportunity to attempt exactly that. The strategic logic was clear: crossing the Pyrenees would bring him to Gaul, crossing Gaul would bring him to the Alps, crossing the Alps would bring him to Italy. The entire strategy depended on doing what Rome believed impossible. If Rome was right, if the mountains could not be crossed, then the war was lost before it began. But if Hannibal could cross them, if he could bring army to Italy before Rome expected attack, then Rome's certainty would become Rome's vulnerability. The army began climbing. The passes were narrow, winding upward through stone that seemed placed deliberately to obstruct human ambition. The trails were barely wide enough for single file. The elephants struggled, creatures of African plains forced through mountain defiles where even goats picked their way carefully. The mahouts coaxed and commanded and sometimes wept with frustration as elephants balked at paths that dropped away into chasms. The tribes attacked, came down from high ground throwing rocks and spears, rolling boulders onto the column, targeting the baggage train where loss would be most devastating. Hannibal's scouts had warned of this, had negotiated with some tribes for safe passage. But other tribes refused all negotiation, saw the Carthaginian army as opportunity for plunder, attacked not to stop Hannibal but to steal supplies and weapons and armor. The fighting was brutal and constant, was not pitched battle but harassment that killed steadily, that wore down the army psychologically as much as physically. Soldiers died, some in combat with the tribes, some from falls when narrow trails crumbled under their feet. Some from exhaustion, the altitude and the climbing drained strength faster than rest could restore it. The dead could not be buried properly, could not be honored with ritual, were left where they fell because the army could not stop, could not pause, could not give the mountains opportunity to trap them. The leaving of bodies was trauma, was violation of every custom about honoring the dead, was necessity that soldiers accepted because Hannibal left them no choice. But something else was happening too. Something that justified the suffering and made it bearable. The army was transforming, was becoming something different from what it had been. The men who climbed the Pyrenees were diverse Africans and Iberians and Celts, mercenaries and tribal warriors and professional soldiers, men who shared no common language or culture or loyalty except to Hannibal. The climbing unified them, created shared experience that bound them more effectively than any oath. It created the understanding that they were attempting something unprecedented, that they were part of something larger than themselves, that if they succeeded they would be legendary. Hannibal walked among them, did not ride while they walked, did not command from distance. His presence was constant, was visible proof that he shared their hardship, that he asked nothing of them that he did not demand of himself. The soldiers saw him climbing the same trails, saw him sleeping on the same cold ground, saw him eating the same meager rations. The shared suffering created bond, created loyalty that was personal rather than professional, created army that followed Hannibal not because they were paid but because they believed in him. The summit was reached. Not a single summit, the Pyrenees had many, but the moment when the army crossed from the Spanish side to the Gallic side, when they descended from high passes into valleys that led north. The achievement was visible proof of what they had done. The mountains that should have stopped them had not stopped them. The impossible had been achieved. The army that emerged from the Pyrenees was smaller than the army that entered, had lost perhaps 10,000 men to combat and accident and desertion. But the survivors were different, were harder, were unified through ordeal, were beginning to believe that under Hannibal's command nothing was truly impossible. The elephants that survived were fewer than half of those that began. The great beasts had suffered terribly. But their survival was itself victory, was proof that even creatures utterly unsuited to mountain crossing could be brought through if will was strong enough. The elephants became symbols, became visible representation of Hannibal's audacity, became the detail that would make the crossing legendary, not merely that he brought army across the Pyrenees but that he brought elephants, that he achieved what should have been fantasy. We close at the highest pass before descent into Gaul. The army resting in thin air where breathing was labor, the mountains behind them testimony to what they had achieved. The mountains ahead, the Alps, promise of greater trial to come. But for this moment there was satisfaction, there was pride, there was the knowledge that they had crossed barrier that was supposed to stop them, had done what Rome believed impossible, had proven that Hannibal's confidence was not arrogance but accurate assessment of what could be achieved through planning and will and shared sacrifice. The sacred silence of peaks that have witnessed and will witness, the mystery of what mountains teach those who dare to cross them. The Pyrenees stood eternal and indifferent, had killed some of Hannibal's soldiers, had tested all of them but had not stopped them, had become not barrier but passage, not ending but beginning, forever steep, forever testing, forever the mountains that guard the end of earth but could not guard against human determination. The Pyrenees crossed, conquered. Left behind as the army marched north toward Italy, toward Rome, toward the destiny that the oath in the temple had promised and that the crossing of impossible mountains was beginning to fulfill. They came from forests south of the desert, from places where ancient trees grew so tall that sunlight touched the ground only in fragments, where the world was green shadow and the sound of water over stones. The elephants were North African forest elephants, smaller than their Asian cousins but powerful, intelligent, capable of gentleness that belied their strength. They were not weapons originally, were not bred for war. Were creatures that had evolved to live in forests and to fear nothing because nothing in their world could threaten them, until humans came, until Carthaginian trainers discovered that elephants could be trained, could be taught to respond to commands, could be transformed from wild creatures into instruments of war. The transformation was not easy, required years of patient work. It required understanding that elephants were intelligent enough to resist, strong enough to kill their trainers if provoked beyond endurance, social enough to bond with humans if treated with respect rather than cruelty. The relationship between elephants and mahouts, the men who trained and guided them, was partnership unlike any other in ancient warfare. A mahout spent years with his elephant, learned its personality, learned what frightened it and what calmed it. Learned how to communicate through touch and voice in languages that had no words but only tone and rhythm. The bond was deep, was mutual. The elephant trusted the mahout. The mahout loved the elephant. Together they formed unit that was more effective than either could be alone. When Hannibal prepared for the Italian campaign, the elephants were essential part of his strategy. Not primarily as weapons, though they would serve that purpose, but as psychological warfare. As creatures that would terrify Roman soldiers who had never seen elephants, who would not know how to fight them, who would break formation from fear before the elephants even reached their lines. The elephants were shock troops, were mobile battering rams, were instruments designed to create panic and chaos in enemy ranks, but bringing elephants from Spain to Italy meant crossing mountains. Meant taking creatures adapted to warm climates and forests through cold and snow and high altitude that would kill them as surely as any enemy spear. Hannibal knew this, knew that many elephants would die, but believed that those that survived would be worth the cost, would provide advantage that would justify the loss. The Pyrenees were hard, the elephants struggled on narrow trails, panicked when paths crumbled, balked at bridges that swayed under their weight. Some fell from cliffs, or simply gave up and refused to continue until they died of exhaustion and despair. The Mahouts coaxed and commanded and sometimes wept for elephants who trusted them but could not understand why they were being led into such suffering, wept for the betrayal of taking creatures who had never known snow and forcing them through frozen passes, wept because they loved their elephants and were killing them slowly through demanding what should not be demanded. But some survived the Pyrenees. 37 elephants reached Gaul, 37 creatures that had crossed what should have been uncrossable. 37 living proof of Hannibal's will imposed on reality. The elephants rested in Gallic valleys, ate grass that tasted nothing like their homeland's vegetation, stood in sun that was weaker than African sun, bore the strangeness because their Mahouts told them to bear it. Then came the Alps. The Alps were not merely higher than the Pyrenees, were different in kind. Were mountains of snow and ice, of cold that could kill in hours, of air so thin that breathing became conscious labor. The elephants had never imagined such cold, had never experienced snow, had never walked on ice that turned solid ground into uncertain surface where each step might be the last. The crossing began in late October, deliberately late, when Roman intelligence would assume that no one would be mad enough to attempt crossing, when surprise would be complete if crossing succeeded. The trails were narrower than in the Pyrenees. The cold was brutal. The elephants' great lungs, adapted to breathe warm, humid air, struggled with thin, cold mountain atmosphere. They began dying quickly. Some from falls ice made paths treacherous, and elephants that lost footing on narrow ledges fell thousands of feet before striking bottom. Some from cold, their bodies could not maintain warmth in freezing temperatures, and they slowly froze despite their Mahouts trying to cover them with blankets and build fires to warm them. Some from simply giving up from the despondency that comes when suffering is too great and the creature can no longer find will to continue. The Mahouts stayed with dying elephants, sat with them as they died, spoke to them in soft voices. He told them they were good elephants, brave elephants, that they had done everything asked of them and more. The Mahouts wept openly. The soldiers saw grown men sobbing over dying elephants and understood that something profound was being lost. These were not just beasts of burden, were creatures that had followed them across impossible terrain, were companions who had shared the impossible journey. One by one the elephants died, the survivors grew fewer. By the time Hannibal's army descended into Italy, perhaps a dozen elephants remained. Maybe fewer, the sources disagree, and the Mahouts were too devastated to keep careful count, but those that survived were transformed, were hardened by ordeal, were elephants that had crossed the Alps, that had achieved what no elephant before or since would achieve, that had become legendary before they ever reached battle. When they finally met Roman armies, the elephants proved their worth. At the Battle of the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, the elephants charged through Roman ranks. The Romans had never seen elephants, did not know how to fight them, panicked when the huge beasts came crashing toward them, trumpeting war cries that sounded like nothing human, crushing men beneath their feet. The psychological impact was devastating. The Romans broke, fled. Lost the battle partly because of tactical errors, but mostly because the elephants created fear that overrode training and discipline. But the elephants were dying. The cold of an Italian winter, mild by Alpine standards but brutal for African creatures, killed them steadily. They developed frostbite on their feet, developed respiratory infections, developed the slow wasting that comes from bodies trying to maintain warmth in climate they were never meant to endure. The Mahouts tried everything. Built shelters, made fires, covered the elephants with every available blanket and hide, but nothing could stop the inevitable. The last elephant died sometime in early 217 BCE. Somewhere in Italy. The exact location is not recorded. The Mahout likely buried it as well as he could, likely spoke words over it that no one else heard, likely mourned alone because no one else could understand what had been lost. The death marked the end. The elephants that had crossed the Alps, that had terrified Romans, that had become symbols of Hannibal's impossible achievements, all dead. Sacrificed, lost, we close in silence. The silence that follows when creatures who trusted us die because we demanded too much. The question hangs unspoken: was it worth it? The tactical advantage, the psychological impact, the proof that even elephants could be brought across Alps. The Mahouts, if they could answer, might say no. Might say that their elephants deserved better than to die far from home in service of wars they could not understand. Might say that the bond between Mahout and elephant was sacred thing that should not be sacrificed for military advantage. But Hannibal might answer differently. Might say that war requires sacrifice, that great achievements demand great costs, that the elephants died but their deaths helped win battles that saved the lives of thousands of soldiers, that the strategic value justified the loss. That sentiment cannot determine strategy. That generals who love their soldiers too much to spend their lives are generals who lose wars. The elephants that carried mountains, forever powerful, forever vulnerable, forever testimony to what we sacrifice for victory. Forever the creatures who trusted us and whom we betrayed through demanding more than should be demanded. The sacred silence where we acknowledge cost, where we admit what was lost. Where we honor creatures who died far from home in cold they were never meant to endure. The elephants, forever crossing mountains, forever dying in snow, forever testifying to the price of impossible achievements. Forever. In the archives of lost battles, in the memories of campaigns that failed, in the silence that follows when armies do not return their Hannibal found his education. His genius was not born from unbroken victory, but was forged in careful study of failure. His father Hamilcar had fought Rome in the First Punic War, had refused to accept defeat even when Carthage surrendered, had taken young Hannibal to Iberia to build new army, new resources, new foundation for the revenge that memory demanded and pride required. Hannibal grew up in military camps, learned strategy not from textbooks but from watching his father rebuild Carthaginian power through conquest of Iberian tribes. The lessons were constant and unforgiving. He watched how Hamilcar negotiated with tribes when to make alliances, when to demand tribute, when to attack and destroy completely. Watched how armies moved the logistics of supplying thousands of men in hostile territory, the importance of securing lines of communication, the need for cavalry to screen movements and gather intelligence. But the deeper education came from studying defeat. Hamilcar made Hannibal analyze Rome's victories in the First Punic War. Made him understand how Rome had won not through superior tactics but through superior persistence. Rome had lost hundreds of ships in storms and battles, had lost entire fleets, had suffered casualties that should have forced surrender, but Rome had rebuilt, had constructed new fleets in months, had refused to accept defeat even after catastrophic losses. That refusal, that stubborn determination to continue fighting regardless of cost, was Rome's true strength. The lesson crystallized into understanding that would define Hannibal's entire strategy. War is psychology before it is tactics. Rome could not be defeated merely by winning battles. Rome had to be convinced that continuing the war was futile, had to suffer defeats so catastrophic that Roman will to continue would break. Hannibal would have to destroy Roman armies so completely, so repeatedly, that Rome's allies would defect and Rome itself would sue for peace. Winning battles was insufficient. He had to break Rome's mind. He studied Roman military doctrine, learned that Roman armies relied on heavy infantry fighting in close formation, that Romans valued discipline and straightforward tactics over maneuver and surprise, that Roman generals were usually competent but rarely brilliant, that Roman political system meant generals served one-year terms and then returned to politics, meaning Roman armies rarely developed long-term strategic vision. These were weaknesses. Were vulnerabilities that could be exploited by general who understood them and planned accordingly. Hannibal also studied Rome's strengths, the Roman confederation system that bound allies to Rome through complex web of treaties and obligations, the Roman ability to raise new armies quickly by calling on this confederation. The Roman Senate's control over strategy meant individual generals could not make peace without Senate approval, meant Rome could continue fighting even after generals were defeated. Understanding these strengths was essential. Meant Hannibal's strategy had to account for them, had to neutralize them, had to find ways to turn strengths into vulnerabilities. When Hamilcar died killed in battle in Iberia in 229 BC when Hannibal was 18, the education intensified. Hannibal served under his brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued building Carthaginian power in Spain. Watched Hasdrubal use diplomacy as effectively as military force. Watched how treaties could be manipulated, how Roman attempts to limit Carthaginian expansion could be undermined through careful negotiation with tribes. Learned that war is not separate from politics but is politics continued by other means. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the army acclaimed Hannibal as commander. He was 26 years old, young for such responsibility, but he had spent 17 years preparing, 17 years studying war. 17 years learning from his father and from Hasdrubal and from his own observations. 17 years building the foundation for what would come. The genius revealed itself gradually. First in small campaigns against Iberian tribes, Hannibal demonstrated tactical flexibility that Romans lacked, would feint and withdraw to lure enemies into ambush, would use terrain brilliantly high ground, rivers, forests to multiply his army's effectiveness. Would employ combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and elephants in ways that created synergy where Romans used units separately. The Spanish campaigns were laboratory, were opportunities to test ideas and refine approaches, were preparation for the greater war that was coming, but the studying never stopped. Even as Hannibal won victories, he analyzed what had worked and what had not. Why had enemy responded as they did? What had they expected? How had their expectations created vulnerabilities? What would he do differently next time? The constant questioning, the refusal to be satisfied even with victory, the determination to learn from every engagement. This was the foundation of genius. Not innate brilliance but cultivated excellence, not gift but achievement earned through disciplined study. The transformation from student into master came through synthesis. Hannibal took what he learned from his father's example, from Roman military history, from his own campaigns, and created something new. Created military doctrine that emphasized maneuver over brute force, surprise over predictability, psychological impact over simple battlefield victory. Created understanding that war is not about killing enemy soldiers but about breaking enemy will. Created strategy that would make him most feared general Rome would ever face. We close in quiet study. Hannibal in his tent at night, alone with maps and reports, planning campaigns not yet begun. The lamplight steady, the silence complete except for scratch of stylus on wax tablet as he calculates distances and logistics and possibilities. Learning from defeats he has not yet suffered, preparing for victories he has not yet won, forever studying, forever preparing, forever the student who became the teacher of war. The genius forged not from natural talent alone but from relentless study of how wars are won and lost. The general who learned from defeat that victory requires more than courage, requires understanding, requires patience, requires willingness to study the enemy until you know them better than they know themselves. Forever learning, forever preparing, forever Hannibal. The student who never stopped studying, the teacher whose lessons are still read today. The Alps in late October rose before Hannibal's army like the final test, like nature's absolute refusal, like the barrier between mortal ambition and divine prohibition. The mountains were white with early snow, the passes were already closing. The valleys were already filling with icewind that could strip warmth from body in minutes. The Roman Senate, when they heard reports of Hannibal's approach to the Alps, dismissed them as impossible, as fantasy. As rumor that could not be true because what it described could not happen. An army crossing the Alps in late October? Impossible. The passes would be snowbound. elephants climbing mountains where eagles struggled, fantasy. 30,000 men navigating terrain that killed shepherds who knew every trail, madness. The Romans were certain, were confident in their geography, were protected by mountains that no army had ever crossed and no army ever would cross. They prepared defenses in northern Italy but did not truly expect attack. Expected that Hannibal would winter in Gaul and attempt crossing in spring if he attempted it at all, but Hannibal was not asking whether the Alps could be crossed, was asking only how. The army stood at the base and stared upward. The Alps made the Pyrenees look gentle, made the earlier crossing seem like preparation for this, the real test, the impossible challenge, the achievement that would make or break not just the campaign but Hannibal's entire strategy. Some soldiers prayed, some wept, some simply stared at the white peaks that disappeared into clouds and tried to comprehend what was being demanded of them. Hannibal addressed them. His words are not recorded precisely, but their essence survives in histories written by men who interviewed survivors. He did not promise easy crossing, did not minimize danger, did not pretend the Alps were anything less than potentially lethal. Instead, he told them the truth that crossing would be hardest thing they had ever done, that many would die, that suffering would be beyond anything they had yet endured. But he also told them why, told them that Italy waited on the other side, that Romans waited unprepared for attack, confident in the mountains' protection. That crossing the Alps meant achieving what no army had achieved, that they would be legendary, that their names would echo through history, that their grandchildren would tell stories of how they crossed mountains that should have been impossible to cross. The crossing began. The first days were manageable. The trails, though steep, were passable. The weather, though cold, was endurable. The army made progress, climbed steadily into altitude where air thinned and breathing became conscious effort. But then the conditions worsened. Snow fell. Not gentle snow, but blizzard that erased trails, that made visibility impossible, that transformed landscape into white void where direction was guesswork and every step might lead over cliff edge hidden by drifts. The narrow trails became death traps, wide enough for men in single file but barely wide enough for pack animals. The baggage train carrying food and equipment and all the supplies army needed to survive had to navigate paths where one stumble meant losing everything. Animals fell, disappeared over edges with loads they carried. The supplies they carried, food, weapons, tents, vanished into chasms that had no bottom visible through swirling snow. Each loss was irreplaceable. Each loss meant army would have less to survive on when they reached Italy. The rockslides were worse than falls. The trails ran along slopes that were barely stable. The weight of thousands of men and animals moving across them triggered slides. Soldiers heard the rocks beginning to move, heard the grinding sound that meant section of trail was about to collapse and tried to run. Some made it, many did not, were buried under tons of rock, died instantly or died slowly, trapped under weight they could not lift, calling for help that could not reach them. The army could not stop to dig them out, could not pause to bury them, kept moving because stopping meant dying, meant being caught on the mountain when true winter came and there would be no survival then. The cold killed more than the falls and rockslides combined, killed slowly, started with extremities, fingers and toes going numb, then painful, then dead. Frostbite claimed hands and feet. Men who survived the crossing would lose fingers, toes, sometimes entire hands or feet to tissue death from cold. But frostbite was survivable. Hypothermia was not. The cold crept inward, into core, into the vital center that maintained life. Men who could not maintain body heat simply stopped, sat down in the snow, stopped moving, stopped caring, died quietly while their companions walked past because there was nothing to be done for them, because stopping to help meant dying too, because the mountain was killing them and mercy was to keep moving and live rather than stop and die together. The psychological toll was immense, was watching friends die, was leaving bodies behind, was the constant fear that the next step would be the step where the trail collapsed or the snow gave way or the cold finally won. Was the grinding awareness that they were beyond help, that if they failed here there would be no rescue, that they were committed to crossing or dying and there was no third option. Some broke, turned around and tried to flee back down the mountain. Most of those died. The descent was as dangerous as the ascent, and men fleeing in panic made mistakes that men moving carefully avoided. Some deserted, slipped away at night hoping to find their way down alone. Few succeeded. The Alps did not forgive solo travelers any more than they forgave armies, but others found strength, found it in comradeship, in helping the man next to you, in sharing what little warmth could be shared, in the silent agreement that they would endure because enduring was the only way to honor those who had already died. The army became closer through suffering, became unified in ways that victory could not create. It became bound by shared trauma that made them not merely soldiers but brothers who had survived together. Hannibal walked among them, as he had in the Pyrenees, did not ride when they walked, did not stay warm in tent while they froze. His presence was constant, was walking testament that their general shared their suffering, that he was not asking them to do what he would not do. The soldiers saw him cold and exhausted and struggling like them, saw him helping men who had fallen, saw him sharing his own rations with those who had lost theirs. The bond created was personal, was loyalty that went beyond professional obligation. They followed Hannibal not because they had to but because they chose to, because he had earned their loyalty through shared suffering. The summit was reached, not suddenly, not with clear moment of transition, but gradually they realized they were descending, were on the Italian side, were past the worst. The descent was still dangerous. Snow-covered slopes were slippery, trails were uncertain. Men who had survived the ascent still died falling on the way down, but they were descending, were moving toward warmth and food and survival, were achieving what should not have been possible. When the army finally descended into the Po River Valley, when they reached Italian lowlands and could finally rest, the cost was counted. Half the army was dead. 20,000 men who had begun the crossing were gone, lost to falls and cold and rock slides and the 1,000 ways that mountains kill. Most of the elephants were dead. The baggage train was depleted. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, starved, traumatized, but they had crossed the Alps, had done what Romans said could not be done, had brought army into Italy before Rome expected attack, had achieved strategic surprise that would shape everything that followed, had proven that under Hannibal's command impossible was merely difficult, had become legendary before they fought their first battle on Italian soil. We close at the base of the Alps, looking back at the white peaks that nearly killed them, the mountains standing eternal and indifferent, the survivors understanding that they had achieved something unprecedented, something that would echo through history, something that would make them forever the army that crossed the Alps with Hannibal, forever the soldiers who did the impossible, forever changed by what they had endured. A forever bound by shared suffering, forever carrying the knowledge that they had survived what should have killed them. The crossing that became legend, the mountains that tested them absolutely, the achievement earned through suffering beyond imagining, forever the Alps, forever Hannibal's crossing, forever the moment when the impossible became simply the next obstacle to overcome, the sacred silence of mountains that have witnessed, the mystery of human will imposed on nature's refusal, forever the crossing. Forever the legend, forever. Lake Trasimene lay still under morning mist in June 217 BCE, water dark as obsidian, shores thick with reeds, hills rising on three sides like amphitheater waiting for performance that would be written in blood. The Roman consul Flaminius marched his army along the lake shore, 25,000 men in column formation, eager to catch Hannibal, eager for the glory that defeating Carthage's general would bring. The Senate had ordered him to shadow Hannibal but not to engage until the other consul could join him with reinforcements, but Flaminius was ambitious, wanted glory for himself alone, wanted to be the man who stopped Hannibal before the Carthaginian could do more damage to Italy. He did not know that Hannibal's army was not ahead but around, hidden in the hills, waiting in the mist, preparing the trap that would make Trasimene synonymous with disaster, that would make this lake a byword for ambush. That would demonstrate Hannibal's genius not just for tactics but for understanding human psychology, understanding that ambitious general could be lured into trap by offering what he most desired. Hannibal had studied Flaminius, had learned that the consul was impetuous, was proud, was eager to prove himself, had recognized that such man could be manipulated, could be made to pursue when caution dictated waiting, could be drawn into position where ambition would become death trap. The plan was simple in concept but required perfect execution. Hannibal would march past Flaminius's position, would seemingly ignore the Roman army, would move as if heading south to ravage more of Italy. The insult, the suggestion that Hannibal did not consider Flaminius worth fighting would provoke exactly the response Hannibal predicted. Flaminius would pursue, would follow along the lakeshore because the terrain channeled movement, would march into the kill zone that Hannibal had prepared. The night before, Hannibal positioned his army, infantry hidden in the hills on the inland side of the road, cavalry concealed behind the hills at either end of the trap, everyone under orders to remain absolutely silent. No fires, no noise, complete invisibility until the signal came. The positions were perfect, were chosen with understanding of terrain that showed Hannibal's genius for ground reading. The Romans would be trapped between the lake on one side and hills on the other, would have no room to maneuver, would be compressed into kill zone where numbers meant nothing and tactical formation was impossible. The morning came wrapped in mist, heavy fog rising from the lake obscured everything beyond arm's reach. Flaminius's column marched into the fog without scouts, without advance guard properly deployed, without the caution that prudent general would demand, marched eager and confident, marched into the trap. The signal came, the war cry split the morning. And from three sides, from hills, from reeds along the shore, from positions the Romans had not known existed, Hannibal's army descended. The Romans had nowhere to run except into the lake. The hills blocked retreat inland. The Carthaginians were closing from front and rear. The only escape was water. The slaughter was not battle but harvest. The Romans could not form up, could not create the tight formations that made Roman infantry effective. Were caught in column, strung out along miles of lakeshore, unable to see more than few feet in the fog, unable to know where enemies were except by the screaming and the dying. Panic spread faster than orders. Men ran toward the lake, ran into each other, ran into Carthaginian soldiers who killed them methodically. Some Romans threw away their armor and tried to swim. The lake swallowed them. The armor had kept them alive in battle, but now pulled them under water where there was no fighting, only drowning. Bodies floated, blood spread across the water. The lake that had been dark and still at dawn was red and churning by mid-morning. The Carthaginian cavalry rode along the shoreline, preventing escape, killing Romans who tried to flee, herding survivors back into the killing ground where infantry waited. Consul Flaminius died fighting. Killed by Gallic cavalrymen who recognized him by his armor and decorations. His body was lost among thousands of others. The Romans who survived the initial ambush were trapped against the lakeshore, fought desperately, died bravely but died nonetheless. By afternoon, 15,000 Romans were dead, 10,000 more were captured. The army that had marched confidently along the lakeshore that morning was destroyed so completely that almost no one escaped to carry word to Rome. Hannibal had not just won, had demonstrated something more terrifying than victory, had shown that he could predict Roman movements, could manipulate Roman generals into doing exactly what he wanted, could create ambushes so perfect that Roman armies walked into them despite being warned, despite having every reason to be cautious. The victory at Trasimene was psychological as much as tactical. It was message to Rome: your generals are predictable, your armies are vulnerable, nowhere in Italy is safe. The aftermath was systematic. The captured Romans were sorted. Roman citizens were held for ransom. Allied soldiers, Italians fighting for Rome but not Roman themselves, were released without ransom. Were told to go home. Were told that Hannibal was not fighting them, was fighting Rome, that they should consider whether their loyalty to Rome was worth dying for. The release was strategy. Was attempt to break apart the Roman Confederation by showing Allied soldiers that Rome could not protect them while Hannibal could show mercy. Some allies did defect after Trasimene, not many but enough to worry Rome, enough to prove that Hannibal's psychological warfare was working. The bodies were left where they fell, the lake shore was littered with corpses. Scavengers came, crows and dogs and carrion birds that darkened the sky. The smell was overwhelming. And travelers would avoid the lake for years afterward because the stench of death persisted, because the memory was too terrible, because places where thousands died violently do not easily return to peace. In Rome, the news created panic. created fear that Hannibal would march on the city, created political crisis as the Senate scrambled to respond. They appointed dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus, who would implement strategy of avoiding battle, of shadowing Hannibal without engaging him, of trying to wear down the Carthaginian army through attrition rather than risk another catastrophic defeat. The strategy would be called Fabian, would be studied for centuries as example of how to respond when facing superior tactical genius. But the strategy was admission of fear. It was acknowledgement that Rome could not face Hannibal in open battle and expect to win. We close at the lake shore at dusk after the battle, the water returning to stillness as if nothing had happened. The bodies being stripped of armor and weapons, the valuable metal being collected, the corpses left to decompose, the crows calling to each other, the mist rising again from the water, the lake that would forever bear the memory of what happened here. That would forever be associated with Roman defeat and Carthaginian cunning. The sacred silence of places where thousands died, where ambition led to annihilation, where a consul's pride drowned his army, the lake lying still and dark, keeping its dead, forever forever the morning when mist hid murder, forever the perfect ambush, forever the lake where Rome's pride drowned, the water dark, the memory darker, forever. After Cannae in August 216 BCE, after the battle where 50,000 Romans died in single afternoon, where Hannibal's tactical genius created slaughter that historians still study with awe and horror, where Rome itself seemed ready to fall, the Carthaginian officers urged him to march on the city. The most famous plea came from Hannibal, the cavalry commander who had led the pursuit that turned Roman defeat into massacre. "Give me Rome, and within 5 days you will dine as victor in the capital." Hannibal refused. The moment passed. The opportunity, if it was opportunity, slipped away. Rome survived, and history has debated ever since. Did Hannibal lack the will to finish what he started, or did he understand something his officers did not? Was the refusal to march on Rome the greatest military mistake in history, or was it recognition of reality that his officers could not see? We open with the question that haunts all great campaigns: when is victory not the same as winning? Hannibal had destroyed Roman armies, had killed more Romans in single battles than any general before or since. Cannae alone, 50,000 Romans dead, was casualty rate that should have broken any nation's will to continue. But Rome was not any nation. Rome was republic that had spent centuries building confederation of Italian cities bound by treaties and common interest. Rome was political system designed to prevent any single defeat from ending the war. Rome was culture that valued persistence above all other virtues, that would endure any loss to avoid surrender. Hannibal understood this. He understood that marching on Rome with the army he had exhausted from Cannae, lacking siege equipment, unable to conduct long siege of major fortified city, would accomplish nothing. Rome's walls were strong. The city could withstand siege for months or years. Hannibal did not have months or years, did not have supplies for extended siege, did not have reinforcements coming from Carthage. An attempted siege of Rome would end with Hannibal's army starving outside unbreachable walls while Rome called up new armies and trapped him. But the deeper understanding was strategic. Hannibal's entire plan depended on breaking the Roman Confederation, on convincing Rome's Italian allies that Rome could not protect them, that alliance with Rome was death sentence, that they should defect to Hannibal's side. Every victory Hannibal won served this purpose. Every Roman army he destroyed was demonstration that Rome was vulnerable. Every Italian city that defected weakened Rome more than any battle could. The strategy was working. After Cannae, multiple major cities switched sides. Capua, second largest city in Italy, defected to Hannibal. Parts of southern Italy turned against Rome. Marching on Rome would undermine this strategy, would transform Hannibal from liberator freeing Italian cities from Roman domination into conqueror threatening the city that was still cultural and religious center of Italy, would unify Italian cities in defense of Rome rather than splitting them away from Rome, would make the war about survival rather than about political allegiance. Hannibal understood that besieging Rome would be the one thing that might unite all Italy against him, so he stayed in southern Italy. Continued the campaign of maneuver and battle, continued trying to detach more cities from Roman alliance, continued demonstrating through victories that Rome could not protect its allies. The strategy was sound, was calculated, was based on realistic assessment of his resources and Rome's capabilities. But the strategy had fatal weakness. It assumed Carthage would support him. Carthage did not. The reinforcements and supplies Hannibal desperately needed never came. The Carthaginian government divided between those who supported the Barcid War against Rome and those who opposed it, sent minimal support, sent occasional shipments but nothing approaching what Hannibal needed to sustain campaign in Italy. The failure was partly political rivalry in Carthage, partly resource constraints as Carthage fought on other fronts, partly strategic skepticism that Hannibal could actually defeat Rome even with reinforcements. Without support from home, Hannibal's position deteriorated. The allies who had joined him after Cannae began defecting back to Rome as years passed, and Hannibal showed he could not protect them from Roman retaliation. The cities that had welcomed him began closing their gates as Roman armies returned and besieged cities that had sided with Carthage. The inevitable was approaching. Hannibal was winning battles but losing the war. The Romans learned from their defeats, learned that they could not face Hannibal in open battle, learned to avoid his preferred tactics, learned to attack his allies rather than attacking him directly. The Fabian strategy, avoiding battle, shadowing Hannibal, wearing him down through attrition, proved effective not because it defeated Hannibal militarily, but because it gave Rome time to rebuild armies and because it demonstrated that Hannibal could be contained. By 211 BCE, 5 years after Cannae, Rome was besieging Capua, the city that had been Hannibal's greatest ally. Hannibal marched on Rome itself not to besiege it but to force Romans to abandon the siege of Capua, marched to within 3 miles of Rome's walls, could see the city that had been his enemy since childhood, could see the walls he had sworn to breach. But the Romans did not abandon Capua, did not panic. did not respond as Hannibal hoped. The march on Rome demonstrated his weakness rather than his strength, demonstrated that he could threaten but not conquer. Capua fell, Hannibal's strategy had failed. The years that followed were slow decline, were campaigns that achieved nothing, were victories that did not matter because the strategic situation was hopeless. Hannibal remained undefeated in battle, remained brilliant tactically, but tactics could not overcome strategic failure, could not compensate for lack of support from Carthage. Could not reverse the reality that Rome would continue fighting regardless of casualties, that Roman confederation would hold together despite Hannibal's victories, that time was Rome's ally and Hannibal's enemy. We close with Hannibal in southern Italy, camped near the coast, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. 16 years after crossing the Alps, still in Italy, still undefeated in battle, still brilliantly maneuvering against Roman armies, but no longer threatening. No longer capable of changing the war's outcome, waiting for the summons that would come in 203 BCE, the order to return to Africa to defend Carthage itself. The sacred uncertainty, is it better to win perfectly and lose ultimately or to compromise and survive? Hannibal won every battle that mattered, demonstrated tactical genius that made him immortal, but could not win the war, could not achieve the strategic objective that all the tactical brilliance served. The victor who could not conquer, forever triumphant in battle, forever denied final victory, forever the general who was too successful to be supported and too isolated to be saved, the paradox, the tragedy, the lesson that winning battles is not the same as winning wars, forever Hannibal, forever the victor who could not conquer, forever. The message arrived from Carthage in 203 BCE, carried by ship across waters that had once been undisputed Carthaginian domain but now were contested by Roman fleets that hunted Carthaginian vessels like wolves hunting sheep. The Senate was summoning Hannibal home, not to celebrate his victories, not to honor his genius, not to acclaim him as the general who had terrorized Rome for 16 years, but to defend Carthage itself, to save the city from Roman invasion. And to become defender when he had always been aggressor. The message was admission of failure, was acknowledgement that Carthage's strategy in Spain and Sicily had collapsed, that Rome had conquered Carthaginian territories everywhere except Italy, that Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, had landed in North Africa with army and was threatening Carthage directly. That Hannibal's campaign in Italy, no matter how brilliant, no matter how many victories won, had not prevented Rome from winning the war everywhere else. Hannibal read the orders, understanding immediately what they meant. Everything he had achieved in Italy, the mountains crossed, the battles won, the Romans killed, the reputation built, would be abandoned. The Italian allies who had risked everything to join him would be left to Roman revenge. The soldiers who had followed him for 16 years through campaigns that should have been impossible would have to evacuate or be abandoned. The dream of bringing Rome to its knees was over. Not defeated in battle, Hannibal had never been defeated in battle, but rendered irrelevant by strategic failure, by Carthage's inability to support him, by Rome's ability to endure losses that should have been unbearable. The evacuation was organized with the same methodical brilliance that Hannibal brought to everything. But evacuation is acknowledgement of defeat regardless of how skillfully executed. The Italian allies who had joined Hannibal now faced Roman retribution. Some begged to be taken to Africa, begged not to be left to Roman vengeance, but ships were limited, could not transport everyone, choices had to be made, soldiers were priority, equipment was priority. The allies, the cities and tribes that had trusted Hannibal's promises were sacrificed. The soldiers who could not be transported were given choice: stay in Italy and try to survive as best they could, or be released from service and attempt to return home through hostile territory. Most chose to stay, chose to settle in southern Italy, to marry local women, to disappear into the population. Some were later hunted down by Romans seeking revenge. Some survived and lived quiet lives, their service with Hannibal becoming secret they carried to their graves. The abandonment was necessary, was unavoidable given the constraints, but was also betrayal, was breaking faith with men who had crossed Alps and fought for 16 years trusting that Hannibal would never abandon them. The elephants, the few survivors that remained after 16 years of Italian campaigns, were killed, could not be taken on ships, could not be left alive to be captured by Romans. The Maihouts who had cared for them for years performed the task, killed the creatures they loved because there was no alternative. Wept as they did it. The elephants that had crossed the Alps, that had survived everything, died not in battle but in evacuation. Died because they had become inconvenient. The killing was mercy of a sort, was ensuring they would not be captured and paraded in Roman triumph, would not be used as spectacle by the enemy. But mercy does not make killing easier for those who must perform it. Hannibal's final night in Italy was spent on the shore near Croton, watching the land where he had fought for 16 years, knowing he would likely never return. The moon rose over water, the camps were being struck, the ships were being loaded, everything he had built in Italy was being dismantled, the allies were being abandoned, the soldiers were being evacuated. The campaign that should have broken Rome was ending not in triumph but in retreat. What did he feel in that moment? The sources do not tell us. Perhaps relief that the burden was ending, that he could stop fighting war he could not win with resources he did not have. Perhaps regret at leaving work unfinished, at abandoning allies, at failing to achieve what the oath in the temple had demanded. Perhaps nothing, perhaps exhaustion had burned away feeling, had left only calculation about what came next. The evacuation, the return to Africa, the final confrontation with Rome that would determine everything. The departure was conducted at night, was designed to avoid Roman interference. The ships slipped away in darkness, left behind the land where Hannibal had won every battle but had lost the war, left behind the allies who had trusted him, left behind 16 years of campaign that had achieved brilliant victories but had failed to achieve the strategic objective that justified them. The ships carried Hannibal and his remaining soldiers toward Africa, toward the final battle. And toward Zama, where the ending would come. Italy receded behind them. The coastline disappeared into darkness. The campaign that had been Hannibal's life's work was ending, was becoming history, was transforming from present reality into past memory. The soldiers who sailed with him understood that something had ended, that they were leaving the place where they had become legendary, that whatever came next in Africa would be different from what had been in Italy. That the initiative, the advantage that Hannibal had always held was passing to Rome, that they were being summoned to defend rather than to attack, that the war they had fought was ending and the war they would fight would be Rome's war, fought on Rome's terms, with Rome holding every advantage. The crossing took days, days of sailing across water where Roman fleets hunted for them, days of uncertainty about what they would find in Africa. Days of soldiers remembering Italy, remembering campaigns, remembering battles won and friends lost, and years spent in service to cause that now seemed to have failed. Days of Hannibal planning, calculating, trying to determine how he could defeat Scipio with depleted army on unfamiliar ground without the advantages that had made him unbeatable in Italy. The African coast appeared. Carthage waited, not the Carthage of Hannibal's youth, not the confident city of purple and gold, but Carthage under siege. A Carthage terrified, Carthage desperate, Carthage that had summoned its greatest general home to save it from consequences of the war it had never properly supported. The summons that ended everything, the evacuation that closed the Italian campaign, the return that transformed aggressor into defender, the journey from Italy to Africa that marked the passage from offense to defense, from independence to desperation, from confidence to fear. We close with ships approaching Carthage. The city visible on the horizon. The harbor, the circular military harbor and rectangular merchant harbor still standing but diminished, threatened, vulnerable in ways they had never been when Hannibal was boy swearing oaths in temples. The return that was not triumph. The homecoming that brought no joy. The ending of the Italian campaign that had achieved everything except what mattered, forever departing. Forever leaving unfinished work behind, forever the summons that ended everything. The ships sailing toward fate, the general returning to fight final battle, the campaign ending not in victory but in evacuation, forever the summons, forever the ending, forever. At Zama in October 202 BCE, two armies faced each other across dusty plains southwest of Carthage, two generals who had never met in battle but who had studied each other for years, who knew each other's methods, who had prepared for this confrontation knowing that it would determine not just the battle but the war, not just the war but the fate of Carthage itself. Hannibal commanded Carthaginian forces defending their homeland. Scipio Africanus commanded Roman forces seeking final victory that had eluded Rome for 17 years. We open with the strangeness of symmetry, with the recognition that this battle was different from every battle Hannibal had fought before, different because Scipio was different. Scipio had learned war by studying Hannibal's tactics, had defeated Carthaginian forces in Spain by using Hannibal's own strategies against them, had come to Africa deliberately, forcing Hannibal to return from Italy, forcing this battle to happen on ground and terms that favored Rome. The student had become the master by learning from the master himself. The battle at Zama would be conversation between geniuses, would be tactical chess match where each move was anticipated and countered. Hannibal's army was compromised from the start. His veterans from Italy, the soldiers who had fought with him for 16 years, who had crossed Alps and won Cannae and survived everything Rome could throw at them, were present but few, perhaps 12,000. The core of his force was fresh recruits, Carthaginian citizens who had never fought, African tribal levies who were unreliable, mercenaries who fought for pay rather than loyalty. The mix was unstable, was nothing like the hardened army he had commanded in Italy, and Hannibal knew it. Knew that these soldiers could not execute the complex maneuvers that had made him unbeatable, knew that he would have to fight differently than he had ever fought before. Scipio's army was opposite, was experienced, was disciplined, was confident. Roman legions that had defeated Carthaginian armies in Spain, allied Italian troops who had proven loyal despite Hannibal's attempts to detach them. Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, the Berber king who had switched allegiance from Carthage to Rome and whose cavalry would prove decisive. The army was everything Hannibal's was not, was unified, was experienced, was commanded by a general who understood Roman methods and Carthaginian methods equally well. The armies deployed. Hannibal placed elephants in front, 80 elephants, the largest elephant force ever assembled. The plan was to use them, as Hannibal always had, to create chaos in enemy ranks, to break Roman formation, to create opportunities for infantry and cavalry to exploit. Behind the elephants came the mercenaries and fresh recruits. Behind them his Italian veterans held in reserve, waiting for the moment when their experience would matter. Scipio countered brilliantly. Arranged his maniples, the small tactical units of Roman infantry with gaps between them, created corridors through his formation. When Hannibal's elephants charged, Roman trumpets and drums created noise that panicked some elephants. The panicked elephants turned back, trampled their own troops. The elephants that continued forward ran through the corridors Scipio had created, ran between Roman units rather than into them, emerged behind Roman lines having accomplished nothing, were driven off by Roman cavalry. The elephant charge, Hannibal's opening gambit, had failed completely. The infantry engaged. The mercenaries and recruits fought bravely but were outmatched, were pushed back by Roman veterans who had fought Carthaginians in Spain, who knew Carthaginian tactics, who were better trained and better led. The Carthaginian first line began to crumble. Hannibal had expected this, had planned for it, pulled his first line back, reformed them with his veterans, created new formation that might hold where the first had failed. But the cavalry was already decided. Scipio's cavalry, Roman horsemen supplemented by Massinissa's Numidians, had driven off Hannibal's cavalry in the opening minutes. Hannibal had always relied on superior cavalry, had used cavalry to envelope Roman armies, to attack from rear, to create the tactical situations that allowed infantry to finish what cavalry had begun. At Zama, cavalry failed him. His cavalry fled, left his infantry exposed, left his flanks vulnerable. Left Scipio's cavalry free to circle around and attack from behind. Hannibal's veterans fought magnificently, held the Roman infantry, created stalemate in the center that might have led to victory if cavalry had been present to tip the balance, but cavalry was not present, was pursuing Hannibal's broken cavalry off the field. The stalemate lasted until Scipio's cavalry returned, returned from pursuit and charged into the rear of Hannibal's formation. The encirclement that Hannibal had created at Cannae, the double envelope that had destroyed 50,000 Romans, was now being used against him. His army was surrounded, was being attacked from front and rear simultaneously. The slaughter that followed was methodical. The Carthaginian veterans fought to the end. Fought because they were veterans, because retreat meant disgrace, because they had followed Hannibal for 20 years and would not abandon him now. But fighting to the end meant dying to the end. Most did. Died defending position they could not hold, fighting battle they could not win, loyal to general who had led them to this. Hannibal escaped, fled the field with small group of survivors. The sources disagree on whether he left before the end or fought to the last moment and then fled when continuation meant death for no purpose. But he left, survived, would live to fight other days in other places. But the battle was lost, the army was destroyed, 20,000 Carthaginians dead. 20,000 captured. The numbers were catastrophic, were comparable to Roman losses at Cannae. Were proof that Scipio had learned, had studied Hannibal's methods and had turned them against their creator. The battle at Zama was not just military defeat, was intellectual defeat, was demonstration that genius can be studied and replicated, that what makes one general unbeatable can be learned by another, that innovation eventually becomes standard practice that can be countered. Hannibal had revolutionized warfare, had shown that battles could be won through maneuver and psychology rather than through simple application of force, had demonstrated that inferior numbers could defeat superior numbers through superior tactics. Scipio had learned all of this, had absorbed the lessons, had become student who surpassed teacher by using teacher's own methods. After the battle, the negotiations began. Carthage sued for peace, accepted terms that were harsh but not as harsh as they might have been. Would lose all territories outside Africa, would pay massive indemnity, would reduce fleet to 10 ships, would become Roman client state, forbidden from waging war without Roman permission. The terms were designed to ensure Carthage could never again threaten Rome, that the Second Punic War would be the last Punic War, that Hannibal's war would end with Carthage's humiliation. We close on the battlefield after the fighting ended, the dead being counted, the wounded being gathered, the prisoners being sorted. The field where Hannibal had fought his last great battle, where his genius had been matched and exceeded, where the war he had fought since childhood had finally been lost. The sacred silence after defeat, the understanding that something had ended that could not be restored, the knowledge that Hannibal, undefeated for 20 years, victor of Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, had been beaten, not by luck, not by accident, but by general who had studied him, learned from him, and used his own methods against him. The battle fought in mirror, the student defeating the teacher, the tactics reflected and reversed, the genius countered by genius learned from studying genius. Forever Zama, forever the battle where Hannibal met his match, forever the ending of the dream that began with oath in temple, forever the defeat that could not be avoided. Forever the moment when brilliance was insufficient because the enemy had learned to be equally brilliant. The mirror, the reflection, the battle where Hannibal's methods defeated Hannibal. Forever. After Zama, after Carthage accepted peace terms that stripped them of empire and independence, after the war finally ended, Hannibal did not retire into obscurity as defeated generals often did not withdraw to private life to write memoirs and tend gardens. Instead, he became reformer, became politician. Attempted to rebuild Carthage economically and administratively, to create prosperity from the ashes of defeat, to transform trading city into power again through commerce rather than conquest. He was elected Suffete chief magistrate in 196 BCE. Used the office to reform Carthaginian finances, to root out corruption that had made indemnity payments to Rome even more burdensome than they needed to be, to reorganize tax collection so that burden was distributed fairly rather than falling primarily on the poor while the wealthy evaded payment. The reforms were necessary, were popular with common citizens, but created powerful enemies among the oligarchic families who had profited from the old corrupt system. Those enemies, Carthaginian nobles whose financial interests Hannibal threatened, made alliance with Rome, sent messages to Roman Senate claiming Hannibal was plotting new war against Rome, claiming he was in contact with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, encouraging the Seleucid king to attack Rome, preparing for revenge. The claims were exaggerated at minimum, possibly fabricated entirely, but Rome believed them, or chose to believe them because believing justified action Rome wanted to take anyway. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender, demanded that Carthage hand over the man who had terrorized Italy for 16 years, who had killed hundreds of thousands of Romans, who had come closer than anyone before or since to destroying Roman power. The demand was not negotiable, was ultimatum, was choice between surrendering Hannibal or facing Roman invasion. Carthage, tired of conflict, fearful of Roman displeasure, desperate to maintain the peace that allowed commerce to recover, was prepared to comply. Was prepared to hand Hannibal over to Romans who would certainly execute him after parading him through Rome in chains as symbol of final Carthaginian defeat. Hannibal learned of the decision before it was announced, learned that his own city was preparing to betray him, learned that the city he had fought to defend, the city whose cause he had served for 40 years, the city for which he had sworn eternal enmity against Rome, was about to hand him to Rome to save itself. The betrayal was complete. Was final proof that Carthage had never deserved him, had never supported him adequately, had always valued commercial prosperity over military glory, had always been willing to sacrifice generals for peace. He fled in the night, alone or with few trusted companions, the sources disagree, fled from Carthage that had been his home, fled from Africa that had been his continent, fled into exile that would last the rest of his life. He was 51 years old. Had spent 42 years serving Carthage since the oath in the temple, had achieved military genius that made his name immortal, had failed to achieve the victory that would have justified the genius, and now was fugitive, fleeing from city he had tried to save. The exile lasted 20 years, 20 years of wandering the eastern Mediterranean, seeking refuge in kingdoms that opposed Rome or that Rome had not yet subjugated. First to Tyre, the Phoenician city from which Carthage's founders had come centuries earlier. Then to Ephesus to join Antiochus III, served as military advisor to the Seleucid king. planned campaigns against Rome, trained armies, tried to create coalition that might finally defeat Rome through combined effort of Eastern kingdoms working together. But the kings did not trust him fully, did not implement his advice completely. He feared that relying too heavily on Carthaginian exile might provoke Rome unnecessarily, feared that Hannibal's presence brought Roman attention they preferred to avoid, used him for his expertise but kept him at arm's length, refused to give him the authority and resources he needed to implement strategies that might have succeeded if kings had possessed will to support them fully. Antiochus went to war with Rome without following Hannibal's strategic advice. Lost catastrophically at Magnesia in 190 BCE. Made peace that required him to surrender all territory west of Taurus Mountains, pay massive indemnity, and surrender certain persons to Rome. Hannibal's name was on the list. Antiochus, like Carthage before him, was prepared to hand Hannibal to Romans to secure peace. Hannibal fled again, fled to Crete, then to Bithynia, each kingdom offering temporary refuge, each kingdom eventually pressured by Rome to surrender him. Each flight bringing him closer to the end. Throughout the exile, Hannibal carried poison, kept it in ring on his finger. The poison was not cowardice, was not fear of death, was control, was refusal to give Romans the satisfaction of capturing him, of parading him in triumph through Rome's streets, of making him spectacle for Roman crowds who would jeer at the general who had once made Rome tremble. The poison was final act of defiance. Was determination that even in death he would choose his own end rather than accept end imposed by enemies. The years of exile were lonely, were existence defined by being from somewhere you cannot return to, by being known everywhere but belonging nowhere, by being remembered for what you achieved but unable to achieve anything new, by being feared and respected but also suspected and isolated, by carrying reputation that was both asset and liability. Asset because it made him valuable advisor, liability because it made him too dangerous to fully embrace. He aged in exile, grew old far from Carthage, far from the city he had sworn to serve, far from the enemies he had sworn to destroy, grew old planning campaigns for kings who would not implement them, advising armies that would not listen, watching Rome expand its power while he could do nothing to stop it. He grew old knowing that his life's work had failed, that the oath in the temple would never be fulfilled, that Rome had won not by defeating him in battle. They had never defeated him in battle except at Zama, but by outlasting him, by being willing to suffer more than he could inflict, by enduring. The final refuge was Bithynia, small kingdom in Asia Minor ruled by King Prusias. Hannibal advised Prusias in war against Roman ally Pergamum, won victories that alarmed Rome. Rome pressured Prusias to surrender Hannibal, sent embassy to demand his extradition. Prusias, like everyone before him, chose peace with Rome over loyalty to Hannibal, agreed to hand him over, sent soldiers to arrest him. Hannibal was at Libyssa in fortress on Bithynian coast, was 6 to 4 years old, had spent 55 years living with the oath sworn in temple, the oath of eternal enmity against Rome. The soldiers surrounded the fortress. Escape was impossible. Capture was imminent. Hannibal looked at the ring containing poison, looked at the soldiers closing in, made the choice he had always known he would make. The words attributed to him vary in different sources, but their essence is consistent. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety. They have not the patience to wait for an old man's death. The words were defiant, were contemptuous, were final assertion of dignity in face of enemies who had pursued him for 2 decades, who had driven him from kingdom to kingdom, who wanted to parade him as symbol of their dominance. He swallowed the poison, died within minutes, died alone or with only servants present. The sources disagree. Died in obscure fortress in foreign land, died far from Carthage, far from Italy where he had fought his greatest campaigns, far from everywhere that mattered, died refusing Romans the triumph they sought. Died on his own terms, died undefeated in the only victory that still remained to him, the victory of choosing his own death rather than accepting death imposed by others. The body was buried at Libissa. Small monument was erected, nothing grand, nothing commensurate with his achievements, just marker noting that here lay Hannibal, who had terrorized Rome and died in exile. The monument disappeared over centuries, was lost, was forgotten. No one knows exactly where Hannibal was buried. The location is disputed, the grave is lost. The greatest general of his age left no physical legacy, no tomb to mark his passage, no place where his descendants, if he had descendants, if he had family, the sources do not tell us, could come to honor him. We close in the fortress at Libissa, in the room where Hannibal died, the poison doing its work. The soldiers outside waiting to arrest man who was already dying, the old general's hand still wearing the ring. The lifetime of war and exile ending quietly, not in battle as he might have wished, not in Carthage as he might have hoped, but in lonely fortress in foreign land, choosing death over capture, refusing enemies' final victory even as they claimed all other victories, the exile who carried poison, the general who chose death over surrender, the man who spent 20 years fleeing rather than give Rome the satisfaction of capturing him, the defiance that persisted until final breath, forever exiled. A forever carrying poison, forever choosing death over defeat, the ring, the fortress, the final refusal, forever Hannibal, forever the exile, forever the ending that was chosen rather than imposed, forever. He died in exile in 183 BCE, was buried in foreign soil, left no heir to continue his vendetta against Rome. The Romans celebrated his death, felt relief that the nightmare was finally over, that the general who had haunted their dreams for 40 years was gone, that the threat had ended. But Hannibal's ghost would not rest, could not rest, because memory is more dangerous than armies, and fear once implanted cannot be completely removed. For centuries after his death, Roman mothers frightened children into obedience by whispering, "Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates." The phrase that had been literal terror during the Second Punic War, the cry that went up when scouts reported Hannibal's army approaching, when sentries saw Carthaginian campfires, when the threat was real and immediate, became metaphorical warning that transcended generations, became shorthand for danger approaching, for enemy at the gates, for terror that could not be reasoned with but only endured. The phrase persisted for centuries, for generations who had never lived through the actual war, for Romans who knew Hannibal only as legend, for children who had never seen Carthaginian soldier but who learned to fear the name. The persistence testified to trauma, to collective memory of existential threat, to understanding that Rome had come closer to destruction during Hannibal's invasion than at any other time in its history. The memory was inherited, was passed down, was kept alive through repetition until Hannibal became more myth than man. We open with the question, what makes a person immortal? Not his victories, which were ultimately overcome. Hannibal won Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae but lost the war. Not his strategy, which was studied but also countered. Scipio learned Hannibal's methods and used them to defeat him. Not his achievements, which were impressive but not decisive. He terrorized Italy for 16 years but did not break Rome's will. What made Hannibal immortal was the fear he inspired, the fear that persisted long after he was powerless to harm anyone, the fear that became part of Roman consciousness, that shaped Roman military thinking, that influenced Roman strategy for generations. Hannibal became mythic figure in Roman imagination, became the enemy against which all other enemies were measured, the standard by which threats were evaluated. The specter that justified military expansion better to conquer potential enemies before they could become the next Hannibal, better to fight wars abroad than to allow another general to bring war to Italy, better to maintain overwhelming military superiority than to risk another invasion. The fear of Hannibal shaped Roman imperial strategy, made Rome aggressive, made Rome unwilling to tolerate potential rivals, made Rome the empire that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean, in part because Romans were determined never again to face threat like Hannibal. Roman generals studied his tactics for centuries. The double envelopment at Cannae became textbook example of perfect tactical victory, was studied at Roman military academies, was analyzed in military treatises, was attempted by Roman generals seeking to replicate Hannibal's brilliance. The irony was complete. Rome preserved and perpetuated the methods of its greatest enemy, made Hannibal's tactical genius part of Roman military tradition, honored him through imitation even while condemning him through memory. Roman historians wrote about his campaigns with mixture of admiration and horror. Livy devoted substantial portion of his history to Hannibal's invasion, described the battles in detail, acknowledged Hannibal's genius while condemning his methods. Portrayed him as great general who lacked moral foundation, as brilliant tactician who served immoral cause, as worthy opponent who deserved respect even while being Rome's most dangerous enemy. The Roman historical tradition preserved Hannibal's memory, made him central figure in Rome's narrative of its own rise to power, made his invasion the crucible that tested Rome and proved Rome worthy. Roman strategists used his failures as lessons in what not to do. The primary lesson: don't fight wars without adequate support from home. Hannibal's genius could not compensate for Carthage's failure to provide reinforcements and supplies. The tactical brilliance was wasted because strategic support was inadequate. Roman military thinkers absorbed this, made sure that Roman generals campaigning abroad received support needed to succeed, made logistics and supply chains priorities. Understood that brilliant general without resources will lose to mediocre general with abundant resources. The second lesson: don't mistake tactical genius for strategic wisdom. Hannibal won every battle but lost the war because tactical victories did not translate into strategic success. Rome learned to think strategically, to understand that war is won through achieving strategic objectives, even if that means losing battles. And to accept tactical defeats if they serve larger strategic purpose. The Fabian strategy, avoiding battle with superior enemy, wearing them down through attrition, became Roman method for dealing with tactically superior opponents, was direct response to Hannibal, was acknowledgement that sometimes survival matters more than glory, but the memory was not purely military. Hannibal became cultural reference point, became symbol that transcended military context. It became metaphor for any threat that seemed overwhelming, any challenge that seemed insurmountable, any enemy that inspired fear beyond rational assessment. The metaphorical Hannibal was more powerful than historical Hannibal, was fear made personal, was danger given face and name, was nightmare that could be summoned by speaking his name. The cultural memory transformed him into something larger than he had been. The historical Hannibal was brilliant general who made series of calculated decisions, who won battles through careful planning, who lost the war through factors partly beyond his control. The mythic Hannibal was unstoppable force, superhuman adversary, enemy who could only be defeated through Rome's superior moral virtue and divine favor. The transformation served Rome's narrative, made Rome's victory seem more impressive. Made Hannibal the ultimate test that Rome passed, the supreme challenge that Rome overcome. For Carthaginians, the few who remained after Third Punic War destroyed Carthage completely in 146 BCE. Hannibal's memory was complicated. Was pride in their greatest general mixed with recognition that his war had contributed to Carthage's ultimate destruction? Was admiration for his achievements mixed with awareness that those achievements had not prevented Rome from eventually erasing Carthage from existence? The Carthaginian perspective on Hannibal, whether they blamed him or honored him, was lost when Carthage was destroyed. The victors wrote the history. Roman accounts of Hannibal are what survived. Carthaginian memories were silenced. In modern times, Hannibal became subject of endless military analysis. Military historians study Cannae as perfect example of tactical encirclement, study his crossing of the Alps as example of operational audacity, study his campaign in Italy as example of strategic failure despite tactical success. The analysis continues because Hannibal's campaigns raise fundamental questions about warfare that have no simple answers. Questions about whether genius can overcome resources, whether tactical brilliance can substitute for strategic support. Whether one general, however brilliant, can defeat nation determined to continue fighting regardless of casualties. We close in sacred silence of remembering, how we remember Hannibal not as he was but as we need him to be. The Romans needed him to be monster who justified their vigilance, enemy whose defeat proved their superiority. Military historians need him to be genius whose methods can be studied and learned. Modern readers need him to be tragic hero, brilliant general defeated not by inferior ability, but by circumstances beyond his control. Each memory serves purpose. Each version of Hannibal answers different need. The truth, if truth can be separated from myth after 2,000 years, is likely more complex than any single narrative allows. Hannibal was brilliant tactician who won battles through careful planning and bold execution. Was strategic thinker who understood Rome's weaknesses and attempted to exploit them. Was man shaped by oaths sworn in childhood, by father's ambitions, by historical circumstances that thrust him into role he spent his life trying to fulfill. Was general who achieved immortality through being remembered, through becoming symbol, through entering mythology, forever remembered, forever feared, forever the memory that Rome could not conquer even after they had conquered everything else. The name that made children obey, the enemy against whom all others were measured, the general whose tactics are still studied, the man who became myth, the memory that refuses to die, Hannibal at the gates, Hannibal in the mountains, Hannibal in Roman nightmares, forever approaching, forever threatening, forever the fear that persists beyond reason, forever Hannibal, forever the memory, forever the name that carried terror, forever, end.